Okay, so welcome to everybody here in Mountain View and to our Googlers tuning in around the world. Good day to you as well. I have the privilege today of introducing Anil Ananthaswamy. He's a consultant for New Scientist magazine, where he has also worked as a staff writer and deputy news editor. His writing has also appeared in National Geographic News, Discover magazine, The Independent, and The Times Online in the UK. Anil is a guest columnist for PBS's Nova on their The Nature of Reality blog. He has a Master of Science from the University of Washington at Seattle, a bachelor's from the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, and he worked as a software engineer in Silicon Valley before training as a journalist at UC Santa Cruz. He's in good company today. Anil won the UK Institute of Physics Journalism Award and the British Association of Science Writers Award for Best Investigative Journalism. His first book, titled The Edge of Physics, A Journey to Earth's Extremes to Unlock the Secrets of the Universe, was voted Book of the Year in 2010 by Physics World. And he also delivered a popular TED Talk in 2010 titled What It Takes to Do Extreme Astrophysics. Today, he's here to talk about his latest book, The Man Who Wasn't There, Investigations into the Strange New Science of the Self. Please join me in welcoming Anil to the podium.
Sajid, and thank you everyone. This is indeed a great pleasure to be here. As Sajid said, I used to be a software engineer, so it's particularly nice to come and speak at Google. I initially was wondering whether I should give a presentation or do a reading, and then after talking with Sajid, we figured that what I'll do is just talk about the book in conceptual terms for about 25 minutes, and then we can discuss. Sajid has some backup questions, but if you have questions, then we can dive into the various issues. And I'm sure the topic is such that each one of us, because each one of us is a self, we will have questions about what that means. So the book is called The Man Who Wasn't There, Investigations into the Strange New Science of the Self. And basically, what I'm trying to do in this book is really take a look at what neuroscience, neuropsychology, psychiatry, all these disciplines are telling us about the nature of the self. So if you have read, books on the self, the philosophy of the self over the last few decades, you would most likely have come across this quote by David Hume. He was an 18th century Scottish philosopher. And he was writing about his notion of the self. And he writes, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." And Hume traditionally falls into what philosophers would call the no-self camp. He is basically saying that if I try to examine within myself the thing that is doing the perceiving, the thing that is experiencing the perceptions, he says he's unable to find anything but the perceptions. So in some sense, he's saying that the sense we all have of being an I that is experiencing, the I that is the subject of experiences, for him is something that comes out of just the bundle of perceptions that we are. So he falls into, for most philosophers today, when they look at what he said, they would categorize him as someone who says there is no self. This whole search for the nature of the self goes back a long way. It's not just a modern obsession. It's been something that people have been wondering about for millennia. And this is another example. This comes from the philosophical traditions of India, which as a country has been maybe sometimes unreasonably obsessed with the nature of the self, but it has been. And there is this is a poem from the 8th century. It's a poem of 6 stanzas, and it's called The Song of Liberation. And basically the approach that this particular tradition within India takes to try to answer who am I, is by looking at things that you're not. So it's basically saying, I am not this, I am not this, I am not this, so maybe what's left over will be what I am. So and the way each stanza progresses, it basically identifies the things that one is not. So the poem is saying, I'm not the mind, nor the intellect, nor any entity that identifies self with ears, tongue, nose, or the eyes, not even perceived by space, earth, light, or the wind. I am. So in this particular poem, the last line of each stanza is an answer to what I am, but it is an answer particular to that tradition within Indian philosophy. And even within India, for instance, there are numerous traditions that have examined this question, and each one has their own answer. So the point is not to focus on the answer given by this particular tradition, because they have their own take on it, and it's an article of faith after a point. But I'm just pointing out that this is a question that has obsessed all of humanity for millennia, literally. And in some sense, it is the question that I'm asking in the book: who am I? And looking specifically at what neuroscience is telling us about that. But before we kind of get into talking about some of the neuropsychological, psychiatric conditions that help us understand a little bit about the nature of the self, what is it that we're talking about when we talk of the self? And here's something that philosophers like to talk about. So I'll set that up a little bit, and then we'll come to what lay people like us might appreciate more. So for philosophers, there is something called synchronic unity. So if you think of what we are right now, you're seeing something, you're hearing something, you're probably feeling the touch of your clothes on your skin. So there are tactile sensations. And what's not trivial and quite amazing is the fact that the person seeing something is the same as the person hearing something, and it's the same person sort of feeling the touch on the skin, feeling the temperature of the air on your skin. So there is a certain unity to your experiences. It's not like someone is hearing and you don't have a sensation that, someone else is hearing the sounds and someone else is feeling some other sensation. All the sensations that your body is receiving is being experienced by the same entity. This might seem very trivial to us because that's how we experience life. But actually, from a philosophical perspective, it's quite a big deal. There is a certain unity to that experience. From a neurobiological perspective, it's also a big deal to try and explain how come all of these sensations feel like they're being experienced by the same entity. I'm not saying person, same entity. What is that thing? So philosophers call it synchronic unity, this unity at this present moment. All your experiences have that unity. There's also another kind of unity. And again, if you think about who you are in your head, if you think back to when you were 4 years old or 10 years old, and also think into the future and imagine your future self, those rememberings and imaginings are going to bring up emotions, bring up perceptions in your mind. And again, if you really ponder upon that, all those perceptions, whatever arises in your mind, again feel like they're happening to the same entity. You don't feel like your 10-year-old self is something or someone different than your present self, and the imagined future self doesn't feel like it's someone different. It is still being experienced as things that are happening or happened to the same entity. So this is another kind of unity, a unity that spans time, and it's called synchronic unity. And again, philosophers wonder and worry about this. How come? Sorry? Oh, sorry, diachronic. So the second one, thank you. The second one is diachronic unity. So, and again, it's not a trivial thing to try and explain neurobiologically. How does the brain achieve this? Or if indeed it's the brain doing it, how does it happen? So these are the kind of questions that, when you talk of the self from a philosophical perspective, these are the two big things that they're trying to explain. What is it behind this unity? Why does it feel like there is the same entity experiencing all the things that we're experiencing right now and, over time? For the rest of us, if you leave philosophers aside, if you look at how William James was a great American psychologist and physician who wrote a lot about the self. He kind of talked about facets of the self. So self, each one of us is never the same thing all the time. We have different aspects, different facets that show up in different situations. So one of the things James did was to divide the self into something called the material me, which is everything that is me or mine. So anything in your mind that has a sense of mineness, whether it's your body, whether it's your relationships, whether it's things you possess. All of those things for him were kind of the material me. He then talked of the social self. Every time you have a social interaction with someone, there is a sense you have of what you are that is specific to that interaction. You may be talking to your boss, you'll have a certain kind of feeling about what you are. You will be talking to someone who works for you, you'll have a different sense for what you are. So, social self is a very integral part of our larger sense of self. He then talked of something called the spiritual self, the sort of internal psychic faculties we all have. So that's one way of thinking about the self. You can slice and dice how we think of ourselves into different facets. The division or the kind of categorization that I really like in terms of trying to understand what we are is this second one, which is dividing the self into something called the narrative self and the bodily self. The narrative self is the easiest to understand in some sense, because if I were to ask you, who are you? Some of you will say, I work at Google, I was at Yahoo, I'm planning to go to Bing, whatever your ideas might be about yourself. But I don't even know whether Bing exists. But so the point is that you have a story in your head about who you are. And it's a story not only that you tell others about who you are, but it's a story that you tell yourself. You don't even it's not even a cognitive telling of the story. It's how you feel about yourself. There is a narrative in your head, and it's a cognitive narrative, and it's also embodied. There are aspects of one's narrative self that is in the body. For instance, if you learned how to ride a bicycle, now you can tell someone, I know how to ride a bicycle. That's a cognitive retelling of your story, because that is part of who you are. But the ability to ride a bicycle is actually embodied. It's not something you consciously recall. It's there in your body, and it's part of your narrative. So there are many, many aspects of who we are, which is really deeply embedded in the body. And you can think of all these things as forming your narrative. But there is another aspect of yourself. If your narrative were to completely shut down, if you forget the fact that we are here sitting at Google, completely let go of all the thoughts about the story that you are, you still are a body experiencing being here and now, right? There is a sense I have of being in this volume of space which is occupied by my body. I have a sense of ownership. I look at my body and it feels like mine. And I have a perspective that I'm looking out at the world from within my head, from behind my eyes. And I also have this sense that what I'm perceiving is sort of private to me, that I have a first-person perspective on the world. And each one of you looking this way, you're all kind of aware that even though you're all looking at the same thing, you all have a sense that your sense of what you're seeing is private to you. And that's kind of part of what the bodily self is, that there is something.
Sort of saying that it's kind of like what you would perceive if you had remember anything about your past or who you were.
Yeah, I mean, assume that for some reason your narrative shut down. Amnesia is a good example. Like if you had retrograde amnesia and you completely forgot everything about who you were in terms of the story that you are, your memories are gone, but you would still be a bodily self, right? So this is another way of thinking about what the self might be. How does the brain and the body together, how do they combine to create these aspects of the self? So, and basically now, given these kinds of definitions, if you were to read about the self and philosophies of the self and neuroscientists, there are still arguments going on about whether there is a self or whether there is no self. Is the self an illusion? And if so, whose illusion is it? So these are arguments that continue to go on. And one of the things that, even if you go back maybe 30, 40 years within neuroscience, there was this idea that the self is something separate from the brain and body. So one of the questions about whether there is a self or whether there is no self was about this question of, is the self a fundamental constituent of nature, just as electrons and quarks and gluons, etc., are fundamental aspects of the material world. So if the body and the brain went away, would the self still exist? Does the self persist beyond the death of the brain and body? So these were questions that were being asked. And in some sense, what philosophers call ontology, so the self, what they were asking is, does the self have its own unique ontological status? Can it be thought of as a fundamental aspect of nature? And that argument now, pretty much most neuroscientists and philosophers would say, no, that's not true. That's the self is really something that arises from the brain and body, and it doesn't persist after you're dead. So there is no ontological status that it has that is separate from the fundamental aspects of the material world. So, but that doesn't mean that the debate about whether there is a self or no self has gone away completely. And in some sense, what I try to do in this book is to take the reader along a journey by looking at various neuropsychological conditions to kind of appreciate what is the heart of the argument. There is still an argument, but it's not clear from the outset if you just sort of read stuff in newspapers about the self being an illusion. What is it that they're arguing about? So the whole book is an effort to bring the reader to the point where you can say, that's what we are arguing about. That's, the argument still persists. It's not resolved because, we don't have empirical evidence. But it's a very, very subtle and fine point that they're fighting over, the philosophers, which is what they do. So disturbances of the self. In the book, I look at these 8 different conditions. I'll talk about a few of. I don't think we'll have time to go through all of them, but I'll just mention a few. But these are the ones: Cotard syndrome, in which people believe and are convinced that they don't exist. Alzheimer's disease, which unfortunately a lot of us would be familiar with because we know someone who's suffering from it. Alzheimer's disease destroys the narrative self. Body integrity identity disorder has to do with notions of ownership of body parts and tells us something about the bodily self. Schizophrenia tells us something about what's called the sense of agency. I'll come to this in a minute. Depersonalization disorder tells us about the role of emotions and the self. Autism tells us something about self-awareness in terms of being able to read one's own mind to have a sense of oneself, and also something about the bodily self. Autoscopic phenomena are things like out-of-body experiences, which we would have all heard about. And out-of-body experiences tell us a lot about how the brain actually constructs the in-body experience. I mean, in order for us to have an out-of-body experience, we should first be in-body, which we are right now. Hopefully all of us are in-body right now. And by looking at how the brain sort of manages to create out-of-body experiences, we actually learn a lot about how we end up being in this body. And then there's a very paradoxical condition called ecstatic epilepsy, where people feel ecstatic, joyful, blissful, and they feel their body state and environment very intensely, but paradoxically they also feel like some boundary between themselves and the outer world has disappeared, and they feel one with the larger whatever universe, the other. Yeah. Meditation can induce autoscopic phenomena. Yes, you can have out-of-body experiences while meditating, but this is purely a neurological or a neuropsychological condition that I'm talking about. So let's look at a few of these. This is one of the most intriguing ones. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. Cotard syndrome is a condition that was identified by a French doctor called Jules Cotard in the late 1800s, and it's a constellation of symptoms that have to come together for the person to be diagnosed as having Cotard's. But the most intriguing symptom in that syndrome is this feeling or conviction that the person has that they're dead, that they don't exist. And I'm seeing a few puzzled faces already, and that's exactly how it should be, because what does that mean? I mean, so in some sense, all of us here are probably, hopefully, really convinced we exist, right? It should not be a matter of doubt. We do. I mean, it's not even something you'll question. Now imagine someone sitting right next to you who's equally convinced that they don't exist. And it happens. So fortunately, it's an extremely rare condition. Only a few hundred cases have been recorded in medical literature. And it's also a state in which the person experiencing Cotard's is extremely depressed. So, and it's a depression that the psychiatrists that I've talked to say that is far worse than even the depression that we are traditionally aware of, that people who are clinically depressed would experience. This is something that goes well beyond that sometimes. So, but there is some alteration in the way they perceive their own body states and their own emotions and feelings. It's a kind of complete dampening down of the vividness of our experience of being a body that is causing this perception to arise in their brain that they don't exist. In addition to that, they seem to have some things that have gone wrong in the brain, where some rational aspects of the brain are also not functioning well, which then prevents them from rationally shooting down this perception that has arisen within them. So it's kind of a two-factor theory to explain, why that might be happening. From a perspective of the self and philosophy, it's a very intriguing phenomenon, because you can still ask, okay, so who or what is the I that says I don't exist, right? So just like all of us will say, I exist, they can say, I don't exist. There is still an I that experiences either existence or non-existence. So in terms of understanding how neurobiologically the brain is bringing about the sense of being an I, the I is still there, even in cotards. Even the person who's saying, I don't exist, the I still exists. So what is that I? That's the question. In some sense, that is the question that is pursued throughout this book, by looking at the various conditions and trying to understand, what aspects of ourself are integral to the I and what aspects are not. So remember the earlier discussion. You can start by saying, I am not this, I am not this, I am not this. So you can keep doing that, and you can, and these neuropsychological conditions allow us to kind of look at ourselves in that way by saying, okay, I'm not this sense of existence or non-existence, because that seems to be a property that I'm aware of. There is still an I that can experience that existence or non-existence. So the question remains, what is that I? So am I my narrative in the sense that am I my story? We were just talking about sort of the larger story in our heads about who we are. It turns out if Alzheimer's disease, one of the things it does, it basically prevents short-term memory from becoming long-term memory. It's essentially you're unable to form new memories. Now, when you think about your narrative self, a key component of that is the ability to remember what has happened to you, right? You have to be able to string together episodes in your life to kind of give it, form that narrative. Now, if a disease like Alzheimer's comes along and basically puts a halt to the formation of new memories, in some sense, it has stopped the narrative self from growing any further. So at the disease onset, it's almost like the narrative self stops forming. But unfortunately, Alzheimer's doesn't stop at that point. The ravages of the disease are such that it actually starts eating away existing memories. So in a sense, it starts scrambling the narrative that you already had and eventually pretty much completely destroying that. So now, if you talk to caregivers and people who take care of patients and people with Alzheimer's, they're going to say things like, especially when the person is in the late stages of the condition, they'll say things like, "Oh, there's no one in there." You will hear these phrases. The self, the person that I knew, is gone. So they have, at least from the outside, we have this impression that whoever was the person that you knew is no more, because there is almost no interaction with the person. You can't infer anything about what might be happening within the person suffering from Alzheimer's. It's very clear that the narrative self is gone. Now, there are philosophers who argue that all that we are is a narrative. You take away the narrative and there is no I. The I comes about because of the narrative, whether it's cognitive or embodied. And Alzheimer's really is forcing us to ask that question very seriously, because once the narrative is gone, once the person is unable to have a story to relate to oneself or to others, does it mean that there is no one in there, really? I mean, in the sense that, is there no one there feeling pain as their own? Is there no one in there feeling hunger as their own? Can they not feel their own body as their own, even though the story is gone? That is an unanswered question right now, because we can't communicate with people with end-stage Alzheimer's and ask these questions of them. And it's a very debilitating condition. So, but that, it does throw up a really important philosophical and neuroscientific question about what remains after the narrative is gone. And for that, you can start kind of looking at, in order to understand what might be happening there are other conditions that tell us a little bit more about how the self might be put together. So body integrity identity disorder, this is also probably a condition that some of you may have heard about it, but not others. So I'll just read out this quote from a book by Oliver Sacks. He had an accident after which he felt like this, and he wrote about it. The leg suddenly assumed an eerie character, or more precisely, if less evocatively, lost all its character and became a foreign, inconceivable thing, which I looked at and touched without any sense whatever of recognition or relation. I gazed at it and felt, I don't know, you are not part of me. So he's basically saying that his leg did not feel like his own. Now this was a transient condition for him, and and it improved and he was okay. But it's a condition that actually can haunt some people throughout their life. And it's actually quite debilitating and can lead them to take some pretty desperate measures. So one way to understand what body integrity identity disorder might be is to think about phantom limbs. And this is something I'm sure most of you have heard of. If someone has had an amputation because of an accident or an infection, some people who have had this amputation will say, oh, I continue to feel my limb. So now it's very clear that the limb is gone because it has been amputated, but they continue to feel the presence of that limb. Some will even feel pain in their limb, because in that phantom limb, and that's called phantom pain. Now, what that is telling you very clearly is that what has happened is that the limb is gone, but a representation of the limb in the brain still persists. Somehow the brain's representation of the limb hasn't reorganized. At least that's one theory for what's happening when you have to explain the perception of a phantom limb. So it's basically telling us that when you perceive your body, what you're perceiving is a representation or information about the body in the brain, not the actual physical limb, right? And if everything is working well, the brain's representation of your body and your body should be the same. And so everything works well. But there are situations like in phantom limbs where the limb is gone because of the amputation, but the representation hasn't changed yet for whatever reason. And you continue to feel that limb. So what you're feeling, what you're perceiving to be your body is actually information in the brain. Now, you can imagine the opposite scenario, which is BIID, where the limb is there, functional, healthy, everything is fine, except that the representation in the brain is somehow not quite caught up with the actual physical body. But because your reality is determined by what is in the brain in terms of the representation, the information content that the brain has, or the model that the brain has of the body, your reality will be dictated by what's, by those models. And if the model for some reason does not include part of your limb or has, some mismatch, that mismatch can be quite debilitating. And in this particular case, people will actually go to great lengths to amputate that limb. So this will be a voluntary amputation. They will actually, go and get a part of their leg or part of their arm amputated. And then, paradoxically, they will say, I feel complete now. So until then, they felt miserable. And actually taking that limb off, that part of the body that, it could be any part of the body, but usually it seems to be the extremities of limbs. It's the amputation that leads to relief, at least at this point of our understanding of the disorder. So, but what is that telling us about the bodily self? I mean, it's very, very clearly at some very basic level, if the neuroscientific understanding of this is correct, then what it's telling us is that our bodily self, the body that we perceive, is really a model in the brain. And that model needs to be congruent with the physical body. And if we have, if everything is working well, it will be congruent. And so reality will match the information content. But sometimes there's a mismatch. And unfortunately for us, it's the information that is sacrosanct, not the physical body. And so when the brain constructs our sense of bodily self, it's relying on those maps in the brain. And those maps seem to be truth. And you can't shake that perception. So let me just quickly touch on schizophrenia, and then we'll go to a Q&A. Now, schizophrenia, again, is fairly common. 1 to 2% of the population worldwide suffer from this. And one of the things that happens in schizophrenia is people hear voices in their heads that don't feel like theirs. And they have thoughts in their heads that don't feel like theirs. And all of this leads to an altered sense of reality. This is what's called psychosis. And it seems like one of the basic neurobiological mechanisms that's leading to all this is something called loss of sense of agency. Now, if, for instance, if I had a bottle of water somewhere, I don't, but yeah, there you go. That's just an example. So if I pick up this bottle of water, I have a very distinct feeling that I am doing this. It's not a doubt in my mind. I mean, all of us, no matter what we do, hopefully you will feel that you are doing it. It's a very implicit sense you have of your actions. And philosophers have long argued that the sense of I, the I that we are, comes from being agents of our actions, comes from this sense of agency. So because we do actions and because we feel like we're the agents of the actions that we do, the sense of an I somehow is constructed from the sense of agency. What happens in schizophrenia, unfortunately, is that they might do the same thing. They might pick up the bottle of water and it'll not feel like they did it. So it'll actually feel like, oh, I'm picking it up, but I didn't will this action. This is not me doing it. And some, when neurobiologists have looked at schizophrenia, at least in some particular scenarios, what they've found is that there is a mechanism in our brain that kind of tags this action as mine and refers that action back to the I, whatever that I is. And in schizophrenia, it seems like that mechanism of tagging an action as mine has gone wrong. And what it's telling you is that actually sense of agency is not constituting the I, right? Because here I am lifting my bottle of water and I feel like I did it. If you were suffering from schizophrenia, you would lift that bottle and you may feel, oh, this is not me doing it. This is not I'm not doing this. But again, you can have the sense of I owning that action, or you can have the sense of I not owning that action. The I still persists. So the questions, it still comes back to the same question. What or who is that I that either perceives a sense of agency or doesn't perceive a sense of agency, right? So schizophrenia just tells you that at least your I is not coming from your sense of agency, that there is something still basic that needs to be explained in order to understand the self, right? So, and this is sort of how the book proceeds. I basically go through depersonalization disorder, autism, autoscopic phenomena, which includes things like autoscopic hallucinations, where you perceive a body next to you, or doppelganger effect, where you perceive a double, your own body in front of you, and you can have an interaction with that double, where you are either located in your physical body or you're located in the illusory body in front of you. You can have out-of-body experiences. These are classical out-of-body experiences where people report just leaving their body altogether and observing the physical body from, say, the ceiling, right? All of these things are telling you something about how the brain constructs the bodily self, how it actually creates an in-body experience. Then ecstatic epilepsy, I mentioned this earlier. So all of these things, if you just look at them, from the perspective of people who are actually suffering from these conditions and understand what it is like to be, experiencing these various conditions, then it actually tells us a lot about how the brain might be putting together the self in the first place. And that's sort of what the arc of the book is. And in the end, in the epilogue, I come to essentially taking all this information that neuropsychology and psychiatry is telling us, then to ask questions about, well, is there a self or is there no self? So, and I will not answer that here right now, because it's actually a very, very subtle point, but it comes down somewhere to understanding the nature of consciousness. There are still people who persist in, I shouldn't say persist, there are still people who insist that there is a self, but it's a particular neural process in the brain that needs to hold a few moments of our experience. I mean, we're at Google and we're all software engineers, so we can understand the notion of a buffer. So you can imagine a buffer of a few moments of experiences, and you can have a moment of experience that is somehow creating this unity that we talked about earlier, and you can have a few moments of experience prior to that and a few moments of moments of experience that are predicted by the brain to come after that, and somehow the brain manages to keep a buffer of such experiences to create a very minimal self, and then from there it starts constructing the larger self that we are, which is either the narrative or the social and all of those things. The bundle theorists like David Hume, and there are a lot of modern philosophers who will fall under that category, who basically say, look, the sense of I that you are is just something that appears because of the interaction of all the perceptions and various aspects of ourself, that there is, if you go looking for it, there is nothing there. And then there are people who say that actually the self fundamentally is a property of consciousness itself, and there we hit a wall because consciousness is such a problem for neuroscience right now. And that would be a huge talk in itself. But yeah, once you come down to that level of debate about the self, you can't escape talking about consciousness, and it's very integral to this whole question of is there a self or is there no self. So I will stop here, and then we can have questions.
Okay, so I guess this sort of relates to the schizophrenia framework and the agents of action. So I used to kind of, think of when I did things as every time I do something, I'm sort of making a conscious decision to do that. But at some point, I realized that it seems that often you kind of set part of your body off on a subroutine. Like, you're out walking, and you just sort of tell your legs, okay, walk. I'm going to go to wherever I'm going. And then while you're walking, you're not thinking about walking. You're thinking about doing whatever else you're doing. Or similarly, you're carrying something, and even though your arm is getting tired and sort of it wants to quit lifting it, carrying the heavy object that you have, it still does it sort of until you tell it that it's done. So how does that sort of relate to this? How does that relate to the kind of agents of agenthood of action if you're kind of setting your body on subroutines like that?
Well, the implicit assumption in your question is that there is a split between the mind and body, that there is something that is outside the body in some sense, you telling the body to do something. And what neuroscience is showing us is actually that split is definitely not as stark as it intuitively feels to us. We kind of feel that there is that split, and hence, centuries of philosophy that comes from Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and all of that, fall out from that. The whole mind-body split was such a big deal for such a long time, but over the last few decades, I think even neuroscience has moved away from that. So it's not quite as simple as saying I told my body, and I guess we're in a software company because we're talking of subroutines. But basically, it probably is not as simple as that the body has its own intelligence, and the brain and body are very, very tightly coupled. So what might seem like giving instructions is probably not as simple as that. So the body is probably giving ample feedback, and you're unconsciously probably responding to a lot of those things. And by the time something filters into conscious awareness, a lot of processing has happened that we're not aware of. So your body and brain are already adjusting and doing a lot of things for you before it enters conscious awareness.
Hello, I have a question quite related to what you were just saying. So if you have a very materialistic view of the world,
sorry, say that again?
If you have a very materialistic view of the world, you can come to the conclusion that willpower is actually an illusion. Like, I feel like I'm choosing to raise my hand, but actually the world is one big algorithm. And out of that, so my hand just moves, and I think I chose to do that. My question is that even when, no matter how hard I believe in materialism, and what is it that I still feel like I have willpower? No matter how hard I try not to, there is no way not to feel the idea that we have willpower.
Yeah, I don't get into the whole question of the whether there is a will or not, because that's another big question in itself. But the sense of agency that I was talking about, actually, the neurobiological mechanism at some level has a very simple model, which is that say you decide to move your arm, your brain is going to send motor commands to your arm to move the arm. So say I'm going to move my arm to pick up this bottle of water. then my brain is going to send commands to the arm to do that. At the same time, the brain sends a copy of those commands to other parts of the brain that are going to predict the sensory consequences of lifting that, right? And then, so now you have two things happening. One is a prediction in the brain that, oh, my arm is going to move and it's going to feel the cold temperature and also a certain amount of weight, right? It's expecting some sensory consequence to that action. And then the actual sensory consequences happen and are fed back into the brain. And the brain compares the two. So there is a prediction that is compared against what actually happened. And if the comparator comes up, again, it's lovely being in a software company because all these things make sense. So the comparator then basically says, my prediction matches the outcome, so it must be I. If for some reason the comparator's output was such that it showed a mismatch, that by implicitly gets tagged as a non-self, or that's why you don't have a sense of agency if you lift it up and for some reason that whole pathway that has to compare prediction with the actual sensory outcome, there's a problem in that pathway somewhere. You can end up with a sensation of not doing something yourself, even though you were the one who initiated and your brain sent the motor commands to the arm. So it was in that context that I mentioned sense of agency. So it was not so much about willpower. There is some argument to be made that even the sense of having a will is a consequence of this sense of agency coming about, right? I mean, if the sense of agency is disrupted, then you will doubt your own, will, because you will feel like, oh, I didn't do that. So
we've got a question from somebody watching on live stream, one of our Googlers, and he's asking, what does deep sleep tell us about the self? What happens to the self during deep sleep?
So, I mean, in terms of if you're dreaming and if you're aware in your dreams, there is a self in that dream. That self, and it's again the same self in some sense, but in your dreams you can do all sorts of weird things that you can't do with your bodies in waking life. So obviously, again, that kind of tells you that it's information processing at the heart of it. It's in deep sleep it disappears, and it's almost like that part of the brain is shut down, and we don't know. We can't query the brain at that point. No one can come out of that, and we just don't have access to that. So it's very unclear in terms of the self as to what happens at that point. The traditional sort of the explanation for that in the way one would understand modern neuroscience would be that whatever brain processes work to create our sense of self, those processes shut down, and and it's part of also losing consciousness, because when you're in deep sleep, you're not conscious either. So they must all be related at some level.
I listened to your Terry Gross interview last week, and so when I found out you were coming today, I was over the moon. Okay. I have a question about the Cotard's syndrome. You mentioned that there's only a few hundred cases known.
Few hundred cases recorded.
Recorded.
There probably are lots of people experiencing it, but in terms of medical literature, yeah.
Okay, that was going to be my question. Are there any living people that you perhaps met with, or psychiatrists?
Cotard syndrome was the only syndrome in the book where I actually couldn't meet a person who was suffering from it. It's a transient condition, thankfully. So and it's very, very severe. So when it's happening, it's really hard to you have to be in touch with the psychiatrists or neuropsychologists who are treating them at that point. So in this one condition, I couldn't actually meet someone in person. So I had to understand what was happening by talking to their doctors and having them tell me what they understood of the condition. For all the other conditions, I did meet people who could narrate and who could tell me what it was like to be, say, suffering from schizophrenia or suffering from autism. This was the only one where, I couldn't.
I wanted to know, where does ego, stand in all of this self theory? Is it like just the materialistic self, or?
I think of the ego as more as the narrative component of our self, right? The story that we are. Now, if you think about it, the story has no boundaries. I mean, you can make up any story you want in your head. It may not have a basis in reality. So there is a conceptual aspect to ourselves, right? We can conceive of ourselves in many different ways, and in some sense, to me, the ego would be that. So the bodily self is something very basic. It's something potentially animals have. It's one of the more primitive aspects of what we are, and on top of that, you have this entire cognitive construct, which is the narrative. So that, to me, would be the ego, and that's the thing that could lead us into trouble more often than not, because you can imagine conceiving of yourself in very grandiose terms, like just narcissism, for instance, is just a narrative gone wild, and that's a problem also. So I think keeping our narratives in check is probably a very good thing.
Continuing that question about deep sleep, I was wondering about like deep sleep versus a coma. Is there any interesting difference in terms of the study of the self? Is it like totally out of scope?
So, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about coma. There is a neurologist at the University of Liège in Belgium, Dr. Stephen Lauries. He studies a lot of patients who are suffering from coma or are what's called unresponsive wakefulness, something that used to be called the vegetative state, but more appropriately now is being called unresponsive wakefulness or locked-in syndrome. So these are all various stages of being conscious. And what he's found is that there are two networks in the brain that are correlated with either external awareness of sensations that are coming from outside the body into us, or an internal awareness network that is responsible for awareness of our own body and its internal states, and thoughts about oneself, so self-referential thinking, right? So there are these two networks, and they seem to be anti-correlated. So if you are really paying attention to something outside of you, then the external awareness network is highly active, and the internal awareness network is damped down, and vice versa. And it turns out that in coma patients, the metabolic activity in those networks is way, way down. So something goes wrong where you're aware, and there must be other reasons also. There are other parts of the brain that are responsible for arousal, just sort of becoming, like as soon as you come out from sleep, something has to switch on, and then all the other activity has to kick in. So in coma, those things are somehow affected badly. But then if you go to the other conditions like unresponsive wakefulness, locked-in syndrome, you'll see differing levels of activity in these networks, suggesting that it's a gradation of consciousness.
Thank you. We have another one from a Googler tuning in from live stream. What do intentionally altered states of conscious tell us about our sense of self, i.e. everything from positive methods such as a runner's high to the negative such as substance abuse, particularly in light of new ways to measure the effect scientifically?
I think, any time you alter your state of consciousness, it's a way of examining, essentially what you're altering is the contents of your consciousness. So you are always, hopefully always conscious, but what's changing is the content of that consciousness in some sense, and that is giving you an idea of how the self feels at that point. So if for instance, you've taken some psychedelic which disrupts some part of your brain that now can't keep a coherent narrative, somehow the narrative part of you has shut down or has fragmented. So it's basically telling you that these are all things that the brain has to work really hard moment by moment to keep it coherent. And you can do things to disrupt it. And so in some sense, they're giving you clues about brain mechanisms that are actually working normally and creating the sense of self, because just being in body right now means that the brain has to integrate all the information that is coming in from outside the body and from within the body, and it is in some sense sampling information and integrating all that information and creating a perception of your body at this moment, and it's doing so moment by moment, and you're perceiving a continuous whole because of this integration. And you can disrupt that integration, whether you do it because of a runner's high. I would imagine a runner's high is going to disrupt your narrative self. You're not thinking about stories in your head anymore. You become acutely aware of the, your own body and your environment. So quite similar to probably ecstatic epilepsy. And psychedelics can do the same. So they do give us clues about how the self is constructed.
Very cool. Thank you.
Couple quick ones. First, it looked like at the end you were trying to use or say consciousness might be the glue that ties it together and sort of identify it with self. And yet then I thought a little more and saying, no, you have the conscious person saying, well, that wasn't me. So there's some tension there I want to hear about. And then I had a side question. I've heard of these experiments where there's timing going on for when a decision happens. And one of the striking findings is the person will say, this is when I've decided it. And yet the report comes up that something was happening in the brain, I don't know, 100, 150 milliseconds earlier.
Right.
And does that speak to any of the notion of where the self really is?
So let's take the second question first, and then we'll come to consciousness. So there was a very classic experiment that was done at UC Berkeley by Benjamin Libet. I think it was in the 80s, where it was an experiment that showed that a person's sense of when he or she did something came after some signal in the brain that had actually initiated that action. So it was almost as if your sense of will was being constructed after the fact. That experiment, people have tried to repeat it, and it turns out that maybe we didn't quite understand exactly what that brain signal was that he was looking at. So there have been various studies that have followed on, and it's still being debated. It's not entirely clear. It's possible that the sense of having a will is also a construction, in a sense. But it's up for debate. I don't think that question has been resolved. In terms of consciousness, there are philosophers and neuroscientists who will argue that all that the self is just moments of consciousness. So consciousness, you can talk of consciousness as having a property called reflexivity, where a moment of consciousness, regardless of whether there's a person behind, just something that is capable of consciousness. And if there is a moment of consciousness, then that moment might have the property of reflexivity, where it's aware of being conscious, right? It doesn't mean there is a subject or a person behind it. It's just the nature of, or the intrinsic property of conscious experience. Now you can imagine all that we are is a string of conscious experiences, each one of which is self-aware without there actually being a person behind it. So if each such experience is a pearl, then we are like a string of pearls strung together. Somehow the brain manages to take all these individual experiences, each one of which has a sense of self-referentiality, and somehow constructs this larger sense of being a person to which all these things are happening, and there might be no person. And that's where the whole self, no self debate kind of hits. That's where the rubber meets the road, sort of. It really is. It ties in with the hard problem of consciousness, trying to explain, how does consciousness arise in a brain that is material and physical, and yet seems to give rise to something that is not seemingly material. So, and right now neuroscience really doesn't have an answer. Philosophers disagree on whether science will ever answer it, or whether the problem will just go away. The more we understand the brain, we don't know.
So I have a meta question, really.
Okay.
So I think this is particularly true of modern physics and neurobiology, that there's the science and there's the interpretation of science. Mm-hmm. And the interpretations tend to vary widely based on the same science. So what do you think is your narrative bias?
My narrative bias, my cognitive bias, probably tending more towards evidence-based science. So I would, is that what you're asking, whether?
So, again, more from what I know, again, I'm a layman in both these fields, but more true of physics. It's like, based on the same evidence, the interpretations can still vary, because a lot of, again, I'm going back to physics, a lot of the research is essentially math. And a lot of the interpretation is trying to make sense of it that somehow matches up with our common sense and the everyday experiences.
I'm not sure physicists would agree with that. I think physics is really trying to explain, the material world in some sense. Yes, there are mathematical, frameworks like string theory, for instance, which are well motivated but haven't yet intersected experiment. So I don't think physicists would say that their math or the science that they do is open to interpretation. In some sense, they are basically explaining the physical world. And you're right, there are mathematical frameworks that haven't yet intersected experiment and hence is open to interpretation. But that is slightly different from saying, here's a body of physics and math that actually has been tested and that is open to interpretation. That is not open to interpretation. It's those frameworks that haven't yet intersected with experiment where the interpretation comes in. Or quantum mechanics, where, that's a really, really weird part of physics. And so there are interpretations about what is happening when you observe things at the quantum level. Yes, I agree. But things like the many worlds hypothesis or the Copenhagen interpretation, and I think that's because at this point we just don't have enough experimental means to delve into reality in ways that can answer or resolve those. They're all open to interpretation at this point.
So you think that neurobiology is at a point where we are sort of more realistic in what we can say to a layman based on the science?
Is it more realistic? No, I think that there is a lot of hype about neurobiology also. I think that we have to be careful. Like, in my book, I talk a lot about brain scans and, looking at the differences in brains of people, say, suffering from one condition versus healthy controls and things like that. But we have to be really cautious that, when you are talking about differences in the brains of people, we're basically seeing correlations. And it has to be very, strongly emphasized that what's being seen is a correlation between a snapshot of someone's brain at a given point in their lives with what they are subjectively experiencing within. It doesn't establish causation. And we do get kind of, carried away by thinking that these things are actually explaining, the cause of something. They're not at this point. To study the causation would require longitudinal studies and a very different kind of study.
So we'll have time for a few more questions during the book signing, but I want to close with two for now. The first one's a little tricky. I'll admit it's kind of hard to phrase, but we were talking about it earlier. So what I loved most about the book is there's so many little anecdotes. You share a story, it kind of captivates you. There's a confusing thing that's going on, a confusing phenomenon. Doctors will kind of give their take, and sometimes they'll give us sort of a bit of a resolution. And early in the book, one of the resolutions is the self is linked to one's body, one's story, and one's social and cultural milieu. Brain, body, mind, self, and society are inextricably linked. What I liked about this, what kind of it provoked some thought in me is I think we take a lot of these aspects of ourself for granted. We sort of know we have a body, we have a mind, we have feelings, a sense of self. But this idea of bringing society into the equation is sort of interesting because I find we sort of blame society a lot for things that we don't like instead of thinking it maybe, or even realizing that it's part of ourselves. So at Google, we take on a lot of social issues, we think about them. We say at Google, society has standards that women shouldn't be engineers or women shouldn't be CEOs or directors or VPs, and we sort of combat society in that way. What I wonder, my very long-winded question is, if we can acknowledge that the society culture is at some point just a part of ourselves, does it not liberate us to then maybe think about how much we want to give a voice to that part of ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge the role of culture and society in who we are. I mean, we were talking about this before the talk began, and I was telling Sachit that, if he's of Indian origin,
absolutely,
right? So, but he grew up in the U.S. I can imagine the same body growing up in India, and it would be a different Sachit. That culture would have a very different impact on him, and the person that he would be very different, even though biologically, neurobiologically even, it would be the same material body. So the culture, society is really a very, very strong aspect of who we are. But then who we are, then, influences the culture. So it's a two-way street, and in some sense, it is both liberating and binding. I would, you can't escape society, you can't escape culture. It's a large part of what we are, but we can influence it too. And so, if you see it that way, then I would say, yeah, it's liberating. Right.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. Question that a lot of Googlers have been pinging me with is, how does a Bay Area SWE software engineer end up going to UC Santa Cruz to study journalism and becoming a journalist?
It was just a 90-mile trip down the road. So, no, I mean, seriously, I was around, I think I was in Berkeley, building network management systems. In fact, I have a colleague from that company who is here at Google. I don't see him here, but I think 4 or 5 years into my software job in Berkeley, I really began to feel the desire to write. And I thought I would be writing fiction. And so I would take a few months off each year and try my hand at fiction. And then somebody told me about the UC Santa Cruz program, which is a science communication program, science writing program. And that was a really key moment, because I really love science and I love reading about it. And it never occurred to me that it is something I could write. So when I found out about the program, I said, okay, it's just 1 year. How wrong can I go? So I went and did the program. The program led to an internship with New Scientist in London. So I went to London for 6 months. And I was still wondering whether I could earn a living doing writing. So I came back. And for the first year, maybe about 10 months, I did double duty, about 3.5 days of writing more code, and then 3.5 days of writing, not code, but journalism. And then 10 months into it, I realized I could pay my bills with writing, and that was it. After that, I haven't been writing code. Though I like writing code, don't mistake me, I think, but I think I like writing, stories much more. So it wasn't a difficult transition in that sense. It's really something I wanted to do.
Very cool. So Anil's new book, The Man Who Wasn't There, The Strange New Investigations into the Strange New Science of the Self, is a captivating, thought-provoking read. It's available today. Anil, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Thank you.